know who it is, and for those of you that don't, I'm Cytonius, the opposite of the phoniest! From Speak Geek Unlimited. And I want to ask you one question.
Can you blush?
Here we go, Poppy.
For a lot of people, 2002 was an important year for blockbuster films. Movies like Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, The Bourne Identity, Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, and the first Spider-Man film helped to solidify 21st century blockbuster franchise films. One film that's rarely mentioned among the 2002 cinematic classics is Blade 2. One thing to consider about why Blade 2 isn't mentioned alongside the other era-defining films of the early 2000s is one important date: 9/11. Now, some people watching this might think I'm being facetious, but it's hard to overlook how much of an impact 9/11 had on not just the political and patriotic consciousness of the United States, but also on pop culture. Before 9/11, a decent amount of big-budget Hollywood movies focused on themes of anti-authoritarianism, with movies like The Matrix, Starship Troopers, and even smaller budgeted films like Fight Club or American History X. Also, natural disaster movies like Independence Day, Twister, and Armageddon. But after 9/11, most of the popular movies of that time could be broken into two subgenres: the post-9/11 catharsis film, which were mostly comedy, fantasy, or romantic films that didn't take place in present time or that didn't have any type of political subtext, or the politically charged 9/11 film, which could range from documentaries like Fahrenheit 9/11 to feature films like The World Trade Center. But Blade 2 doesn't fall under any of those categories. For most people, Blade 2 was just another throwaway action horror film. But in my opinion, Blade 2 has aged a lot better than some of the other films of that time. I think the reason Blade 2 is aged like fine wine is because, unlike a lot of films of that era, it isn't pretentious like The Matrix Reloaded or filled with middle America nostalgia like Spider-Man. And despite being a movie about a stoic vampire hunter, the movie isn't cynical. For a lot of people, Blade 2 is considered the best of the three Blade films. And one of the key factors of the movie's success is director Guillermo del Toro. By amping up the vampire and horror elements of the first movie and adding a bit more of the fantastical and superhero elements to the franchise, Del Toro creates a Blade film that acts as a precursor to his work on the Hellboy franchise, but also reminiscent of his previous films Kronos and Mimic. A fun fact about Blade 2 is that the original idea for the film was that it would take place in the future and have Blade team up with Hannibal King and Frank Drake and form the Night Stalkers.
No.
Like some of the best movie sequels, Blade 2 takes what was done in the first film and raises the bar. Instead of repeating the formula with the same characters in the same city doing the same thing against a different villain, this film goes international, with Blade in Prague searching for his mentor and father figure Abraham Whistler, while also being recruited by a team of vampires called the Blood Pack to take out an evolved version of vampires called Reapers. The Reaper strain was engineered under the instructions of vampire overlord Eli Damaskinos, who was portrayed by German actor Thomas Kretschmann. The look and design of Damaskinos and the Reapers are based on Count Orlok from the 1922 German silent film Nosferatu: A Symphony of Horror. A fun fact about Count Orlok is that he was portrayed by Max Schreck. No, the other Max Schreck. Yeah, him. The original look for Damaskinos had long blonde hair and,
No.
aside from Damaskinos looking like Michael Bolton, the first two Blade films have an overlooked theme of class warfare, with Blade and Whistler representing blue-collar working-class superheroes, and vampires representing an upper-class aristocracy, with the Damaskinos family as head of the vampire nation. Damaskinos created the Reaper strain because he wanted to make a stronger version of vampires with all of their strengths and none of their weaknesses. Sound familiar? In the original script, the DNA that was used to create the Reaper strain actually came from Blade. In the first film, vampirism is treated like a sexually transmitted disease like chlamydia or gonorrhea, but the Reapers are treated like another STD, AIDS. The subtext of Reapers and the Reaper strain share a lot of parallels with two major social issues of the 80s, the AIDS pandemic and the crack epidemic. So it's safe to say that Reapers are AIDS-infested crackheads. And like crackheads and drug addicts, they need to feed daily. Unlike the other vampires and villains of the Blade films, who mostly have distinct personalities and goals, the Reapers operate as a collective with one alpha male leading the pack. Jared Nomak is the son of Eli Damaskinos and is the patient zero of the Reaper strain. Nomak is the antagonist of the film, but I can't go as far as calling him the villain of the film. In fact, I would call Nomak the antithesis of Deacon Frost. In the first film, Deacon Frost is a power-hungry and overly ambitious Generation X vampire supervillain, whereas Nomak is a victim of circumstance who gains power without even wanting it. Nomak is played by Luke Goss, who, like Steven Dorff, were teen idols of the 80s. Luke Goss was a member of the European boy band The Bros, who at one point was just as popular as the New Kids on the Block. And you can do whatever you want with this information. In my opinion, Nomak isn't as complex or as charismatic of an opponent as Deacon Frost was for Blade. Deacon Frost was more of a cerebral villain for Blade, using subterfuge and strategy to antagonize the Daywalker.
How you doing, Chief? Easy. Wouldn't want our little friend here to wind up on the back of a milk carton now, would we? It's nice to finally meet you, man. Had my eye on you for years. I know all about you. Your serum, Whistler, everything.
Sunblack.
Hey, it's a start, right? The goal, of course, is to be like you. Daywalker. You got the best of both worlds, don't you? All our strengths, none of our weaknesses.
Whereas Nomak is more of a physical threat to Blade.
We need the same thing, Blade.
The conflict between Blade and Nomak is also less personal than Blade versus Frost. In the first film, Deacon Frost is the vampire that bit Blade's mother and caused him to become a vampire, which makes their conflict a father versus son battle, as opposed to Blade and Nomak, whose conflict is pretty much Blade good, Reapers bad. Blade has to stop Reapers, which in my opinion is a bit shallow. What's interesting about Nomak is that his character arc parallels Blade's in the first film. In the first film, it's established very clearly that Blade hates vampires and struggles with his vampire thirst. In Blade 2, it's established early on that Nomak also hates vampires and struggles with his thirst as a Reaper. The difference being that Nomak doesn't possess the discipline and support system that Blade has with dealing with his thirst. It's also interesting that our first introductions to both Blade and Nomak show them slaughtering vampires. Speaking of Blade, Wesley Snipes does a banging job of bringing Blade back to life for Blade 2. Snipes reprises the character without repeating the same character beats from the first film. Blade in the first film was more of a self-loathing and brooding character, but here Blade is as self-assured and competent as we'll ever see him. Even the design of Blade has evolved, with him having less of an urban armored vigilante look, with layers of black armor and trench coat being replaced by a new trench coat with the red interior similar to Count Dracula. And they even gave my dude a fresh shape up with the Widow's Peak, similar to Dracula. This time Blade has a love interest, Nisa, who was played by Chilean actress Leonor Valera, who replaces Dr. Karen Jensen as the main female component of the mostly male sausage fest that is Blade 2. To be honest, I think Karen Jensen was a much more interesting character than Nisa, and I wish she would have at least made a cameo. In my opinion, Nisa is just eye candy and doesn't have a very interesting character arc. In fact, I don't even think she's an interesting love interest for Blade. Nisa seems like an homage to the Batman villain Talia al Ghul, which is fine. because that would make Eli Damaskinos an homage to Ra's al Ghul, which is also fine. But Nyssa doesn't have the complexity and duplicitous femme fatale persona of Talia al Ghul or Selena Kyle. In fact, I think a better film would have had Nyssa aware of Damaskinos' plan to create Reapers and eliminate Blade, and we could have seen her struggle with her developing feelings for Blade in spite of this. Now, I'm not saying I hate the character Nyssa, I just think she was a bit underwritten in comparison to Karen Jensen. Now, what I do think the film does better than the first film is give us interesting and entertaining supporting characters. This film has a much larger cast to match the larger stakes of the threat of the Reaper strain, with new characters like Scud and the Blood Pack working with Blade. In fact, the only character to return from the previous Blade film is Abraham Whistler, who's treated like a bit of a wild card and possible traitor after being turned into a vampire by Deacon Frost in the first film. The film also does a great job at misdirection. The movie does a good job of playing with our expectations on whether or not Whistler will double-cross Blade, and a key element into why that plot point works so well is because of the character Scud. Scud is played by Norman Reedus, who most people know as Daryl Dixon from the TV show The Walking Dead. Scud is Blade's mechanic and acts as a Generation X placeholder for the baby boomer Whistler. It's really interesting to see Scud and Whistler fight over who's more worthy to be Blade's partner, for it to only be revealed that, spoiler alert,
I'm one of Damaskinos' familiars. They needed my help to bring you here to control Nomak. The old fuck, he was always just bait. I mean, look at him. He's your only real weakness, man. You may be fast, you may be strong, and all that other bullshit, but in the end, B, you're just too human.
Well, you little shit.
You think they scoped out my security system? I let them in, asshole! I practically handed them the keys! You heard Q-Ball, right? Pretty soon they're all gonna be daywalkers, man. When that happens, I'd rather be a pet than cattle. You got me, B? What do you think about that, man?
Two things. One, I've been on to you since they turned you. Two, it's not a dud.
Oh, great.
Scud was the traitor all along. Because of the Reapers, Blade has to form an alliance with a group of mercenary vampires called the Blood Pack, who've been training to kill him for the past 2 years. The Blood Pack consists of Nyssa, Assad, Lighthammer, Verlaine, Priest, Chupa, Snowman, who was of course played by Donnie Yen, and Dieter Reinhardt, who was played perfectly by Ron Perlman. In the original script, Reinhardt was intended to look more like an Austrian Arnold Schwarzenegger blonde muscle man type. And I don't know if the audience missed this, but Reinhardt's beef with Blade goes way beyond him being the Daywalker. And if you don't believe me, watch this scene one more time.
What was that?
Can you blush?
Here we go, Poppy.
Aside from the racial subtext of a white man asking a black man if he can blush, Blade 2 is the most visually appealing of the 3 Blade films, with color grading and texture that give the film a sleek but grungy look. Also, this film has the best fight choreography of the 3 films, with 2 separate fight teams choreographing the action. The first team is Jeff Ward and Wesley Snipes, who give Blade more of a street fighting style with techniques from martial arts systems like Pinchuk Silat and Kenpo, and the second team led by Donnie Yen and Wesley Snipes, who give Blade more of a Hong Kong traditional wushu style of fighting. In fact, the final fight between Blade and Nomak is the best fight in the entire franchise, and one of the best superhero fights put on screen. Instead of a sword fight like in the first film, this is an all-out street brawl that looks more like a stylized Kimbo Slice fight, with kicks and elbows and slams that, in my opinion, are a lot more entertaining and impactful than some of the more overly choreographed fight scenes in modern comic book films. So with all of this being said, Do I think Blade 2 is the best of the Blade films? Well, in some ways yes, and in some ways no. I think Blade 2 is a better horror action movie than Blade 1, but I think Blade 1 is a better movie about Blade. As I mentioned before, the first Blade film does a great job at establishing the inner conflict of Blade. There's also a stronger racial subtext, with Blade learning to find peace with his half-human, half-vampire heritage, similar to a child who has a mixed racial background. In Blade 2, those themes are downplayed in favor of a more straightforward horror action movie, which is perfectly fine. It really boils down to what you're looking for in a Blade film. Personally, I prefer the urban, martial arts, modern blaxploitation vibe from the first film. But I can also appreciate the European horror creepshow vibe from Blade 2. I think Blade is at its best when it embraces the multi-genre aesthetics of horror, martial arts, and blaxploitation. So for me, the perfect Blade film is the first and the second film. So with that being said, I actually want to know what your favorite Blade movie is. Let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, remember to subscribe to Speak Geek Unlimited for new videos dropping every Monday. And I'm out. Peace.